The words that would destroy my family forever were spoken on a Tuesday evening in our suburban Connecticut living room, right in front of my grandmother, two aunts, and my younger cousin, who is only 12 years old. My mother looked directly at me with cold, disgusted eyes and said with absolute clarity, "We wish Savannah were our only daughter." My father nodded in agreement, his face twisted with disappointment as he glanced at my sister Savannah, who sat on the cream-colored sofa with a smile that could only be described as triumphant. I was 23 years old, standing in the doorway with my work bag still hanging from my shoulder, having just returned from my shift as an emergency room nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital. I had worked a double shift, 16 hours of chaos and suffering, and I came home to this. The silence that followed my mother's declaration was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock my grandmother had brought from Portugal decades ago. My grandmother's wrinkled hand flew to her mouth, my aunts exchanged horrified glances, and my young cousin Emma looked at me with tears already forming in her innocent brown eyes. But I didn't cry. Not a single tear fell from my eyes as I stood there processing what had just been said, what had just been wished into existence in front of witnesses who would remember this moment forever. The story of how I reached this devastating moment begins 3 years earlier, when Savannah was 19 and I was 20, both of us living at home while attending different universities in Connecticut. Savannah had always been the golden child, the princess who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, even when she was clearly doing everything wrong. She studied communications at a prestigious private university that cost our parents $60,000 a year, money they paid willingly and proudly, while I attended a state nursing school on a combination of scholarships, loans, and my own savings from working part-time at a local pharmacy. The difference in how our parents treated us wasn't subtle or hidden. It was blatant, obvious, and painful in ways that shaped every aspect of my childhood and young adult life. Savannah received a brand new white Mercedes for her 18th birthday, while I received a used Honda Civic with 120,000 miles on it for mine, and even that came with the condition that I would pay for my own insurance and gas. When Savannah wanted to study abroad in Barcelona for a semester, our parents didn't hesitate to wire her $5,000 for expenses, but when I asked for $300 to help pay for my nursing board exam preparation course, my father told me I needed to learn financial responsibility and find a way to earn it myself. The disparity wasn't just financial. It was emotional, psychological, and deeply rooted in some twisted perception my parents had created about who their daughters were. Savannah was beautiful in a conventional way. With long blonde hair she straightened religiously every morning, bright blue eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a slim figure she maintained through yoga classes and expensive smoothie cleanses. I was different, with darker brown hair that I usually kept in a practical ponytail, green eyes that people said were intense, and a cuvia build that came from genetics rather than lifestyle choices. But the real difference wasn't in our appearances. It was in our personalities and choices. Savannah was charming and social, always surrounded by friends, always posting perfect pictures on social media, always saying exactly what our parents wanted to hear. I was quieter, more serious, more focused on my studies and career goals, and apparently, that made me less lovable in my parents' eyes. If you're listening to this story and finding it relatable or engaging, I want to ask you to do something important for me right now. Click that subscribe button below this video. We're working toward reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to this channel. It takes just 1 second, but it helps us continue bringing you stories that matter. Now, let me continue with what happened next. The incident that led to my mother's cruel declaration started 2 weeks before that terrible Tuesday evening. Savannah had dropped out of university in her junior year, a decision she announced casually over Sunday dinner as if she were discussing the weather. She explained that she wanted to pursue a career as a social media influencer, that she had already gained 15,000 followers on her lifestyle account, and that she believed she could turn it into a full-time income within 6 months. I watched my parents' faces carefully, expecting disappointment or anger, expecting them to question this impulsive decision that was throwing away 2 years of expensive education. Instead, my father smiled and told her he was proud of her for following her dreams. My mother reached across the table to squeeze her hand and said that not everyone was meant for traditional paths, that some people were destined for more creative and modern careers. I sat there in stunned silence, my fork hovering over my plate of roasted chicken, remembering how they had reacted just 6 months earlier when I had mentioned possibly taking a semester off to save money. They had been furious, telling me I was being irresponsible, that I was throwing away my future, that I needed to finish what I started no matter what sacrifices it required. But Savannah's announcement wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she added that she would need to live at home rent-free for at least a year while building her brand, and that she would need access to our parents' credit card for purchasing clothes, makeup, and equipment for her content creation. Again, they agreed without hesitation. My father even suggested they could convert the basement into a proper studio space for her, complete with professional lighting and a backdrop wall. Meanwhile, I was still being charged $300 a month for rent despite working full-time at the hospital and contributing to household expenses like groceries and utilities. When I pointed out this obvious unfairness during a private conversation with my mother later that evening, she looked at me with genuine confusion and said that my situation was different because I had a stable career path, while Savannah was taking a risk and needed support during her vulnerable entrepreneurial phase. The logic made no sense, but arguing with my mother never led anywhere productive. She had already decided that Savannah deserved special treatment, and no amount of reasoning would change her mind. Over the following weeks, Savannah transformed our family home into her personal content creation factory. The basement renovation cost our parents $18,000, money that came from their retirement savings, the same savings they had told me were untouchable when I had asked for help with a $5,000 hospital bill from an emergency appendectomy the previous year. Savannah spent her days filming videos about morning routines, skincare regimens, fashion hauls, and motivational content about following your dreams despite obstacles. The irony of her talking about obstacles while living in a custom-built studio rent-free with unlimited financial support wasn't lost on me. Her follower count did grow, reaching 30,000 within a few months, but the income she generated was minimal, barely enough to cover her coffee shop visits and nail appointments, let alone contribute anything to the household. Yet my parents continued to praise her, to share her videos on their own social media accounts, to introduce her to their friends as their daughter the influencer with such obvious pride in their voices. Meanwhile, my own career was progressing significantly. I had passed my nursing board exams with excellent scores, secured a position in the emergency department at one of the best hospitals in the state, and was being fast-tracked for a leadership role due to my strong performance and dedication. I worked 12-hour shifts that often extended to 14 or 16 hours when the department was short-staffed or dealing with major emergencies. I witnessed suffering and death regularly, held the hands of scared patients, delivered devastating news to families, and made split-second decisions that literally determined whether people lived or died. The emotional and physical toll was immense, but I found meaning in the work, purpose in being able to help people during their worst moments. I thought my parents would be proud of me, that they would recognize the value and difficulty of what I was doing. Instead, they barely acknowledged my achievements. When I told them about my promotion to senior nurse, my mother said that was nice and immediately changed the subject to ask Savannah about a brand deal she was negotiating with a small cosmetics company. The emotional neglect I experienced wasn't just about the lack of praise or recognition. It was about the constant comparison, the endless subtle and not-so-subtle messages that I wasn't measuring up to my sister despite working harder and achieving more concrete success. At family gatherings, my mother would introduce Savannah first, spending 5 minutes talking about her influencer career and showing people her Instagram account, before briefly mentioning that I was a nurse with a quick, "and this is our other daughter," that felt like an afterthought. My father would tell stories about Savannah's funny videos or her growing follower count, but never mentioned the time I had helped save a teenager's life after a car accident or the thank you letter I received from an elderly patient's family. If you're still with me in the story, I want to remind you that your subscription to this channel really matters. We're on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who clicks that subscribe button helps us get closer to that goal. It's free, it takes just a moment, and it supports storytelling that connects us all. Please, take a second right now to click subscribe. Thank you. Now, back to how everything fell apart. The breaking point came during my grandmother's 78th birthday celebration, the Tuesday evening I mentioned at the beginning of this story. My grandmother, my father's mother, had always treated me and Savannah equally, with genuine love and interest in both our lives. She was a strong woman who had immigrated to America from Portugal in her 20s, worked multiple jobs to support her family, and built a life of dignity and hard work that she instilled in her children and grandchildren. She had been asking about my work at the hospital, genuinely interested in the challenges I faced and proud of the difference I was making in people's lives. My aunts, my father's two sisters, were also present, along with my Aunt Maria's daughter Emma, who was 12 and looked up to me as a role model because she wanted to become a doctor someday. We were all gathered in the living room before dinner, and my grandmother was asking me about a particularly difficult case I had mentioned during a phone call earlier that week. A young mother who had been brought in after a severe allergic reaction and whose life we had managed to save through quick intervention. As I was describing the medical details and the emotional aftermath of speaking with the woman's grateful family, Savannah interrupted from her position on the sofa. She was scrolling through her phone, clearly not paying attention to the conversation, and she suddenly announced that she had just reached 50,000 followers and had secured a partnership with a medium-sized fashion brand that would pay her $2,000 for 3 promotional posts. My parents' faces lit up with excitement and pride in a way I had never seen when I talked about my work. My father immediately stood up, walked over to Savannah, and hugged her tightly, telling her he always knew she would be successful and that this was just the beginning of her amazing career. My mother actually had tears in her eyes, tears of joy and pride for this accomplishment that paled in comparison to saving someone's actual life. The conversation completely shifted away from me and my grandmother's questions, everyone now focused on Savannah's brand deal and asking her questions about the partnership and what it meant for her future. I stood there feeling invisible, feeling like everything I had worked for and achieved meant nothing to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My grandmother looked at me with sad, knowing eyes, understanding exactly what was happening and how it must have felt. Then my Aunt Clara, perhaps trying to bring the conversation back to balance, mentioned that she had heard from a colleague at her work that the emergency department at St. Catherine's was considered one of the best in the region, and that having a daughter working there must make my parents very proud. It was a kind attempt to redirect some attention and acknowledgement toward me, but it backfired in the worst possible way. My mother's face tightened with an expression I had seen before, an expression of annoyance and defensiveness. She glanced at Savannah, then at me, and then said words that would echo in my mind forever. Actually, Clara, we're much more proud of Savannah. At least she's doing something unique and special with her life. The room went completely silent. My Aunt Clara looked shocked, my Aunt Maria's mouth dropped open, and Emma's young face crumpled with confusion and sadness. My grandmother's hand gripped the armrest of her chair, her knuckles turning white. I stood there processing what my mother had just said, the casual cruelty of it, the complete dismissal of everything I had worked for, and everything I did every single day. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to point out the obvious injustice of comparing saving lives to posting pictures online, but before I could speak, my father joined in. He looked at me with genuine disappointment in his eyes and said, "Your mother's right. You've always been so serious and difficult, always making things harder than they need to be. Savannah knows how to enjoy life and make people happy. Honestly, we wish Savannah were our only daughter. Our lives would be so much simpler and more joyful." Time seemed to stop. The antique clock's ticking became deafening. The air felt thick and impossible to breathe. My mother nodded in agreement with my father's words, and Savannah, instead of defending me or expressing shock at what our parents had just said, smiled. She smiled that triumphant, satisfied smile of someone who had finally received confirmation of what she had always believed, that she was better, more loved, more valuable. I looked at each family member in the room, seeing their reactions, seeing their horror at what had been said, and something inside me broke. Not in a way that made me collapse or cry or scream. It broke in a way that made me cold, clear-headed, and absolutely determined. I had spent 23 years trying to earn my parents' love and approval, trying to be good enough, trying to prove my worth through achievements and hard work and doing everything right. And in that moment, I realized I would never be enough for them, that nothing I did would ever matter because they had already decided that Savannah was the daughter they wanted, and I was just the burden they tolerated. I looked directly at my mother, then at my father, and said in a calm, steady voice, "Okay, if that's what you wish, I'll make it come true." They looked confused by my response, probably expecting tears or an argument or some kind of emotional breakdown they could later use to paint me as unstable or dramatic. Instead, I turned to my grandmother and said, "Happy birthday, Vovo. I love you." Then I walked upstairs to my room, closed the door, and began making plans. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and started executing a strategy one had spent the entire sleepless night developing. I called my hospital administrator and requested an immediate meeting, explaining that I had a personal situation requiring relocation and asking about transfer options to other hospitals in the hospital network. I was valuable enough to the organization that they wanted to retain me, and by the end of that meeting, I had secured a transfer to a partner hospital in Seattle, Washington, across the entire country from Connecticut. The position came with a signing bonus of $10,000, relocation assistance, and a modest increase in salary. I accepted immediately. Over the next 3 days, I worked with methodical precision. I opened a new bank account at a different bank from the one my parents used, ensuring they would have no access to or knowledge of my finances. I transferred all my money, closed my old accounts, and set up direct deposit for my new position. I researched apartments in Seattle and secured a lease on a modest one-bedroom place near the hospital, paying the deposit and first month's rent using part of my signing bonus. I contacted a moving company and scheduled them to pack and transport my belongings the following week. I changed my phone number and email address, creating completely new contact information that my parents wouldn't have. I removed my parents as emergency contacts at my workplace and with my insurance providers, replacing them with my grandmother. I drafted a formal letter to my parents, clear and concise, explaining that I was leaving and that they should not attempt to contact me. Your subscription to this channel means we can keep sharing stories like this one. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and you can be part of that milestone. Just click the subscribe button. It's right there, easy to find, and it supports content that matters. Thank you for being here, and now, let's continue with what happened next. On Saturday morning, exactly 5 days after my parents' devastating declaration, I left my childhood home for the last time. I timed my departure for when my parents and Savannah had left for one of Savannah's content creation events at a local fashion boutique. I loaded my car with the personal items I wanted to keep with me during the drive to Seattle, things like important documents, photos from my childhood that included my grandmother and aunts, my nursing credentials and awards, and clothes for the cross-country trip. The moving company would handle the rest of my belongings the following week. I left a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter addressed to my parents, along with $300 in cash to cover my last month's rent payment. I wanted to owe them nothing, to leave with complete financial and emotional independence. The letter inside that envelope was brief and straightforward, with no emotion or accusation, just facts. It read, "You wished for Savannah to be your only daughter. I've decided to grant you that wish. I'm leaving Connecticut and will not be maintaining contact with you going forward. Don't try to find me or reach out. This is what you wanted and now you have it. I hope you're happy with your choice." Before I left, I went to my grandmother's apartment, which was just 15 minutes from our family home. She was expecting me, having sensed what was coming after the terrible scene at her birthday celebration. We sat in her small, cozy kitchen that always smelled like fresh bread and coffee, and I explained everything I had planned. She cried, not because she wanted me to stay and endure more pain, but because she understood why I had to leave, and she knew she would miss me terribly. I promised her I would stay in touch with her, that she was the one person in the family who had always loved me unconditionally and treated me with genuine respect and affection. I gave her my new phone number and email address, making her promise not to share them with my parents under any circumstances. She held my hands in her worn, strong hands and told me in Portuguese that I was brave, that I was valuable, and that my parents were fools who didn't deserve a daughter like me. She also told me something that would prove prophetic. They'll regret this, Minhanita. When they realize what they've lost, it will be too late. I hugged her tightly, breathing in her familiar scent of lavender soap and old books, and then I left to begin my 3,000-mile journey to a new life. The drive to Seattle took me 5 days, traveling through Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, and finally Washington. I drove alone with my thoughts, processing 23 years of emotional neglect and favoritism, grieving the family I had wanted but never truly had, and gradually feeling lighter with every mile I put between myself and that house in Connecticut. I listened to podcasts about nursing leadership and personal growth. I stayed in budget motels each night. I ate at diners and watched the landscape change from eastern forests to Midwest plains to mountain ranges to Pacific Northwest evergreens. By the time I reached Seattle on the 5th day, I felt like a different person. The weather in Seattle was overcast and drizzly, typical for October in the Pacific Northwest, but I found the gray skies and constant moisture somehow comforting, like the city itself was creating a protective barrier between my past and my future. I moved into my apartment, a small but clean one-bedroom place in the Capitol Hill neighborhood with hardwood floors, large windows, and enough space for my modest belongings. The moving company delivered the rest of my things 2 weeks later, and I slowly transformed the empty space into a home that was entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences without any input or judgment from parents who had never valued my opinions anyway. I started my new position at Harborview Medical Center, one of the premier trauma and emergency hospitals in the Pacific Northwest, and immediately felt welcomed by colleagues who appreciated my skills and experience. The work was demanding and intense, but I thrived in the environment, finally in a place where my contributions were recognized and valued. Seattle itself was a revelation, a city full of coffee shops, bookstores, hiking trails, and people who seemed to care more about authenticity than superficial appearances. I made friends with other nurses, joined a book club at a local independent bookstore, started hiking in the nearby mountains on my days off, and slowly built a life that belonged entirely to me. Meanwhile, back in Connecticut, chaos was apparently unfolding, though I didn't learn the details until several weeks later when my grandmother called me with an update she felt I needed to hear. According to her, my parents had returned home that Saturday afternoon to find my letter on the kitchen counter. At first, they thought it was some kind of dramatic gesture, that I would come back in a few days once I had calmed down, and they could smooth things over with some minimal apology. When they tried calling my old phone number and found it disconnected, when they sent emails that bounced back as undeliverable, when they drove to the hospital and learned I had transferred to another facility across the country, they finally began to understand that I was serious. My mother, according to my grandmother, had a complete breakdown, alternating between rage that I had dared to leave without permission and panic about what other people would think. My father kept insisting I would come back, that I was just being immature and would realize I couldn't survive without their support, despite the fact that I had been financially independent for years. Savannah's reaction was the most telling. She was initially thrilled that I was gone, seeing it as confirmation of her superior status in the family and enjoying having our parents' complete attention focused solely on her. But within days, cracks began to appear in her perfect influencer facade. The fashion brand partnership she had been so excited about fell through when the company discovered she had inflated her engagement metrics using purchase followers and likes, a common but unethical practice among wannabe influencers desperate to appear more successful than they actually were. The brand pulled the deal, demanded their advance payment back, and posted a statement on their social media about the importance of authentic partnerships, essentially blacklisting Savannah in the industry. Her follower count began to drop as the algorithm detected the fake engagement and deprioritized her content. Other brands she had been in talks with suddenly stopped responding to her pitches. Her influencer career, built on a foundation of lies and our parents' money, began to crumble rapidly. Without my financial contribution to the household, my parents started noticing the strain on their budget. I had been paying $300 a month in rent, contributing to groceries and utilities, covering my own car insurance and phone bill, and generally requiring very little from them despite living at home. Savannah, on the other hand, was living completely rent-free, using their credit cards for her content creation expenses, eating food they purchased, and contributing absolutely nothing financially or practically to the household. The $18,000 they had spent on her basement studio now seemed like an absurd waste of money, especially since she wasn't generating any income to justify the investment. My father's retirement savings, already depleted by that expense, took another hit when his company announced unexpected layoffs and offered early retirement packages that included significantly reduced benefits. He had been planning to work for another 5 years before retiring, but the layoffs changed his timeline and financial projections dramatically. If you've been following along with this story, I hope you'll consider subscribing to our channel. We're building a community here, working toward that goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your subscription is free, and it helps us tremendously. Click that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Thank you, and let's continue. By mid-November, about 6 weeks after I had left Connecticut, my grandmother called me with more updates. My mother had been calling her almost daily, desperate for my contact information and for any information about where I was and what I was doing. My grandmother, true to her word, refused to provide any details beyond confirming that I was safe and doing well. This infuriated my mother, who accused my grandmother of choosing me over the rest of the family and being disloyal. My grandmother, never one to tolerate such manipulation, reportedly told my mother that she was reaping exactly what she had sown and that perhaps this was an opportunity to reflect on how she had treated her daughters differently for their entire lives. My aunts had also been calling, expressing shock at how quickly I had left and sadness that they hadn't had a chance to say goodbye properly. They understood why I had left, having witnessed the cruel declaration at my grandmother's birthday party, and several of them had apparently confronted my parents about their behavior and treatment of me over the years. The family dynamics that had been maintained through silence and avoidance for decades were now exploding into open conflict. My Aunt Clara had apparently told my father that she was ashamed of how he had spoken to me, and that his favoritism toward Savannah had been obvious and damaging for years. My Aunt Maria had told my mother that she had failed as a parent by creating such an unequal environment, and that she needed to take responsibility for driving away a daughter who had only ever tried to be good enough. Even my younger cousin Emma, only 12 years old, had apparently said something profound that stuck with my grandmother. She had asked my mother why she had been so mean to me when I was the one who saved people's lives and helped others, and why she loved Savannah more just because she was prettier and took pictures for the internet. The innocence and honesty of a child's observation cut deeper than any adult criticism could have. But the real consequences for my parents were just beginning to unfold. In early December, my father's company finalized the layoffs, and he was given a choice between accepting an early retirement package with reduced benefits or potentially being laid off in a later round with even less compensation. He reluctantly accepted the early retirement, but the financial implications were severe. His pension would be 30% less than anticipated, his health insurance would be more expensive, and the timeline for when he could access various retirement benefits had shifted unfavorably. The comfortable retirement they had been planning, filled with travel and leisure and financial security, now looked much more modest and constrained. They had spent so much money supporting Savannah's failed influencer dreams and so little time planning for the reality that my contributions to their household budget had actually been significant and necessary. My mother, who had never worked outside the home since having children, now faced the possibility of needing to find employment in her 50s with limited recent work experience, a daunting prospect in a competitive job market. Savannah's situation continued to deteriorate as well. Her follower count dropped below 40,000 as fake accounts were purged and real followers lost interest in her increasingly desperate content. She tried pivoting to different niches, attempting lifestyle vlogging, then wellness content, then motivational speaking, but nothing gained traction. The algorithm had essentially buried her account, making it nearly impossible for her to reach new audiences or rebuild her credibility. She began spending even more money, our parents' money, on courses and coaching programs that promised to teach her how to go viral or beat the algorithm, but these were mostly scams that provided generic advice and took her money without delivering results. By mid-December, she had spent nearly $15,000 of our parents' money on these programs, equipment upgrades, and promotional campaigns that went nowhere. My parents, now facing serious financial constraints due to my father's early retirement, finally put their foot down and cut off her access to their credit cards. This created an entirely new crisis in their household. Savannah, who had never been denied anything by our parents, who had never faced consequences for her choices or learned to support herself financially, completely fell apart when confronted with actual limits. She screamed at our parents, accusing them of not believing in her and sabotaging her dreams. She threatened to move out, but quickly realized she had no money, no job, no real skills beyond taking selfies and writing captions, and nowhere to go. She had no savings because she had never needed to save. She had no employment history because she had never had to work. She had no practical life skills because our parents had always handled everything for her. She was 22 years old, a college dropout with a failed social media career, and absolutely no backup plan. The princess had never considered what would happen when the castle ran out of money and patience. In January, my parents reached out to my grandmother again, this time not just asking for my contact information but begging for it. They claimed they wanted to apologize, to make things right, to ask if I would consider coming back to Connecticut or at least reopening communication with them. My grandmother called me to relay this message, and I listened carefully to her description of their current situation. She told me about my father's early retirement, about the financial strain they were under, about Savannah's complete failure to launch, and the tension in their house. She also told me, with characteristic honesty, that she suspected their desire to reconnect with me had less to do with genuine remorse and more to do with practical need. They were likely realizing that I had been the responsible, reliable daughter who would have helped them navigate these difficulties, while Savannah was proving to be a liability rather than an asset. I thanked my grandmother for the information and told her I wasn't ready to respond to their request and might never be ready. She understood completely. My life in Seattle, meanwhile, was flourishing in ways I had never experienced in Connecticut. I received a promotion at work in January, moving into a charge nurse position that came with additional responsibilities and a significant salary increase. I was respected by my colleagues, valued by my supervisors, and making genuine connections with the patients and families I served. I had joined a community choir that performed at local events, something I had always wanted to do, but never had time for when I was working multiple jobs to support myself in Connecticut. I had started dating a physician at the hospital, a kind and thoughtful man who treated me as an equal and genuinely appreciated my intelligence and compassion. I had friends who invited me to dinner parties and hiking trips and movie nights, friends who cared about my well-being and celebrated my successes. I was, for the first time in my life, truly happy and at peace. The gray Seattle weather that people always complained about felt like a cozy blanket to me, and the mountains that surrounded the city reminded me daily that I had escaped to somewhere beautiful and new. February brought more news from Connecticut through my grandmother's regular updates. My parents had decided to sell their house, the 4-bedroom colonial they had lived in for 30 years, because they could no longer afford the mortgage, property taxes, and maintenance costs on my father's reduced retirement income. This was a massive step, indicating just how dire their financial situation had become. The house had been their pride and joy, the symbol of their success and stability, and now they were being forced to downsize significantly. They were looking at small condominiums and rental apartments, a dramatic change from the spacious home they had always known. Savannah was apparently devastated by this development, upset that she would lose her basement studio and the bedroom she had decorated exactly to her preferences. She still had no job, no income, and no prospects, but she was more concerned about losing her content creation space than about her parents' financial crisis. The house sold in March for slightly less than asking price, and my parents moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a less desirable part of town. Savannah had to share her bedroom with her studio equipment, which meant she had barely any personal space and certainly none of the aesthetic background walls and professional setup she had grown accustomed to. My grandmother reported that the tension in their household was extreme, with constant arguments about money, about Savannah's lack of contribution, about the choices that had led them to this point. My mother had started working part-time at a local department store, something she found deeply humiliating after decades of presenting herself as a comfortable suburban housewife. My father was struggling with the loss of his professional identity and the reality that his retirement looked nothing like what he had planned. And Savannah was stuck in a small apartment with parents who were increasingly resentful of her presence and her continued dependence on them. By April, 6 months after I had left Connecticut, my parents tried a different approach. They sent a letter to my grandmother's address, asking her to forward it to me. She called first to ask if I wanted to receive it, and I agreed, curious about what they would say. The letter arrived at my Seattle apartment a week later, a thick envelope containing handwritten pages from both my parents. My mother's letter was emotional and apologetic, claiming that she had said terrible things she didn't mean, that she had always loved me, that she had been going through a difficult time and had taken out her frustrations inappropriately. She said she missed me and wanted me to come home so they could be a family again. My father's letter was similar but more practical, mentioning that they were going through financial difficulties and that having me back would help the family unit function better. He didn't explicitly ask me for money, but the implication was clear. Neither letter mentioned Savannah directly or acknowledged the years of favoritism and unequal treatment that had led to this point. These were not genuine apologies seeking forgiveness and reconciliation. These were strategic appeals designed to manipulate me into returning and resuming my role as the responsible daughter who could help fix their problems. I read both letters carefully, took a day to process them, and then wrote a response. I kept it brief and clear, with no room for misinterpretation. I wrote, "I received your letters. I appreciate that you're experiencing difficulties, but those difficulties are the consequences of choices you made consistently over many years. You chose to prioritize Savannah over me emotionally and financially. You chose to dismiss my achievements while celebrating her failures. You chose to tell me, in front of multiple family members, that you wished I didn't exist. Those were your choices, and now you're living with the results. I've built a good life here in Seattle. I'm happy, successful, and surrounded by people who value me. I have no intention of returning to Connecticut or resuming contact with you beyond this letter. I hope you find a way forward, but that path doesn't include me. Don't write again." I sent the letter to my grandmother's address with instructions to forward it to them, and I meant every word. Please take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference. Click that red subscribe button and be part of this growing community. Thank you for being here with me. Now, let me tell you what happened next. Summer arrived in Seattle with its famous beautiful weather, warm and sunny after months of clouds and rain, and I felt like my life was finally in full bloom. I moved into a larger apartment with my boyfriend, the physician I had been dating who had become my partner in every meaningful way. We adopted a rescue dog, a sweet mixed breed named Scout, who loved hiking as much as we did. I took a vacation to Vancouver Island, my first real vacation in years, where I spent a week hiking coastal trails, kayaking in pristine waters, and reading books on quiet beaches. I was promoted again at work, this time to a nurse manager position overseeing the entire emergency department during night shifts. I was making more money than I had ever imagined possible. I was respected and valued in my career, and I had a personal life filled with love, friendship, and genuine happiness. Sometimes I would think about my parents and Savannah back in Connecticut, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no longing. Just indifference, which was perhaps the truest sign that I had healed and moved forward. In August, almost a year after I had left, my grandmother called with news that marked a turning point in the Connecticut situation. Savannah had finally gotten a job, but not the glamorous career she had always imagined. She was working as a cashier at a grocery store, making minimum wage, and required to wear an unflattering uniform. My grandmother said that Savannah was miserable, complaining constantly about the work being beneath her and the customers being rude. But she had no choice. My parents had insisted she either find employment or move out, and she had nowhere else to go and no money to support herself. The reality of adult life, The reality I had been navigating independently since I was 18 was finally crashing down on the golden child who had never been required to face consequences or develop resilience. My grandmother also mentioned that Savannah's social media accounts had become essentially dormant. She occasionally posted a photo or story, but her engagement was almost non-existent. The dream she had sacrificed her education for, the dream my parents had funded with tens of thousands of dollars, had completely died. My parents' situation had stabilized somewhat, though at a much lower standard of living than they had enjoyed previously. My mother was working full-time now at the department store, having been promoted to a supervisor role that paid slightly better. My father had taken a part-time consulting position with his former company, swallowing his pride to accept hourly work after decades of salaried management. Together they were managing to pay their bills and maintain their modest apartment, but there was no money for extras, no budget for travel or restaurants or the comfortable lifestyle they had once taken for granted. My grandmother said that my mother had aged significantly in the past year, stress and regret evident in every conversation they had. She said my father rarely smiled anymore, the weight of his financial mistakes and lost relationship with me clearly affecting his mental health. And she said their relationship with Savannah had become strained and transactional, more like frustrated landlords dealing with a difficult tenant than parents bonding with their beloved daughter. The irony of the entire situation wasn't lost on anyone, least of all my grandmother, who had predicted this outcome from the beginning. My parents had wished for Savannah to be their only daughter, and in a very real sense, they had gotten exactly what they wished for. They had me, the responsible, capable, successful daughter who would have been there for them during difficult times, who would have helped them make better financial decisions, who would have contributed to household expenses and offered emotional support during my father's career transition. But they had pushed me away, dismissed my value, and explicitly stated they didn't want me. Now they had Savannah, the daughter they had chosen, and she was proving to be exactly as self-centered, entitled, and useless as her upbringing had prepared her to be. They were stuck in a small apartment with an adult child who resented them for not continuing to fund her fantasy lifestyle, who contributed minimal money and no emotional support, and who reminded them daily of the catastrophic failure of their parenting choices. In September, my parents made one final attempt to reconnect with me. They somehow found my phone number, possibly through some mutual acquaintance or through persistent detective work, and my mother called me on a Tuesday evening. I was at home after a long shift, preparing dinner with my boyfriend, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Connecticut number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My mother's voice on the other end was tentative and emotional, immediately launching into an apology that felt rehearsed and desperate. She said she was sorry for what she had said at my grandmother's birthday party, that she had been wrong to favor Savannah, that she realized now how valuable I was and how much they needed me in their lives. She cried as she spoke, telling me that the past year had been the worst of her life and that she couldn't stop thinking about the daughter she had lost. I listened without interrupting, letting her say everything she needed to say. When she finally paused, waiting for my response, I spoke calmly and clearly. I told her that I appreciated the apology, but that it changed nothing. I explained that the problem wasn't just the words she had said at that one dinner. The problem was the pattern of behavior that had existed my entire life, the systematic favoritism and emotional neglect that had shaped my childhood and young adulthood. I told her that I had spent 23 years trying to earn love that should have been freely given, and that I was done trying. I explained that I had built a good life without them, that I was happy and successful and surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not in comparison to anyone else. I said that I forgave them for my own peace of mind, but that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation or restoration of a relationship. I wished them well and told them not to contact me again. Then I hung up. My boyfriend, who had heard my side of the conversation, hugged me tightly and asked if I was okay. I realized I was more than okay. I felt strong, clear-headed, and absolutely certain of my decision. That phone call was the closure I didn't know I needed, the final confirmation that leaving had been the right choice and that maintaining my boundaries was essential for my well-being. I had no regrets about my decision, no second thoughts about the bridge I had burned. Some relationships are too toxic to maintain, even with family, even with parents. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to walk away and build a life that honors your worth and potential. That's what I had done, and I would never apologize for it. If this story has resonated with you, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to ask you one more time to subscribe to this channel. We're building something meaningful here, working toward that milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your click makes a difference. Please hit that subscribe button right now. Thank you for being part of this community. October arrived, marking exactly 1 year since I had left Connecticut. I celebrated quietly with my boyfriend and close friends, toasting to new beginnings and to the courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone else expects you to sacrifice for their convenience. I had been in my nurse manager position for several months and was excelling in the leadership role. My department had the highest patient satisfaction scores in the hospital, and my team respected and trusted my judgment. I was making a six-figure salary, something I had never imagined possible when I was struggling to pay for nursing school while working multiple jobs. I had a retirement account that I contributed to regularly, savings in the bank, and complete financial independence. I had a loving relationship with a partner who treated me as an equal and celebrated my successes. I had friends who genuinely cared about my well-being. I had a life that I had built entirely on my own terms, without any help or support from parents who had never believed in me anyway. My grandmother continued to be my only connection to Connecticut, and I cherished our weekly phone calls where she would tell me stories from her life in Portugal, share recipes she thought I should learn, and update me on family news when relevant. She was proud of me in a way my parents had never been, and her pride meant more to me than any recognition from them ever could. She also shared occasional updates about my parents and Savannah, not because she thought I would change my mind about contact, but because she understood that information could be empowering even when reconciliation wasn't desired. In November, she told me that Savannah had been fired from her grocery store job for repeatedly showing up late and arguing with managers about her schedule. She had quickly found another position at a fast food restaurant, but quit after 2 weeks because she claimed the work was degrading and the smell of fryers made her nauseous. She was currently unemployed again, living with our parents who were at their breaking point with her behavior and attitude. In December, my grandmother shared that my parents were considering asking Savannah to move out, but they had nowhere to send her and no confidence that she could survive on her own. They had created this dependent, entitled person through years of overindulgence and lack of boundaries, and now they were trapped dealing with the consequences. My grandmother also mentioned, with a touch of satisfaction in her voice, that my mother had recently admitted to her that she had been wrong about which daughter she should have valued and supported. She had said, according to my grandmother, that she realized now that I had been the daughter who truly loved and respected them, while Savannah had only loved what they could provide for her. My grandmother had apparently responded that this realization had come too late and that they would have to live with the choices they had made. I appreciated my grandmother's loyalty and her refusal to excuse my parents' behavior or encourage me to forgive and forget for the sake of family peace. As Christmas approached, I felt no nostalgia for family traditions or past holidays. My boyfriend and I hosted a small gathering at our apartment, inviting colleagues and friends who didn't have family nearby or who, like me, had chosen to create new traditions separate from complicated family histories. We cooked together, exchanged modest gifts, played board games, and laughed until our sides hurt. It was the best Christmas I could remember, full of genuine warmth and connection rather than the tense performances and unspoken resentments that had characterized holidays in my parents' house. On Christmas evening, after our guests had left, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was Savannah. The message was long and rambling, switching between anger and pleading, accusing me of abandoning the family and begging me to come back because everything had fallen apart since I left. She blamed me for our parents' financial problems, claiming that if I had stayed and helped, none of this would have happened. She said I was selfish for building a new life while they struggled. She demanded that I send money to help them, suggesting that I owed them for raising me. I read the message twice, feeling a mix of disbelief and dark amusement at the audacity. Savannah, who had contributed nothing to the household for years, who had squandered tens of thousands of dollars of our parents' money on a failed vanity project, who had been handed every advantage and opportunity only to waste them all, was calling me selfish. The lack of self-awareness was almost impressive. I considered responding, laying out in detail exactly why her accusations were absurd and her expectations were delusional. But then I realized she didn't deserve my time or energy. Instead, I blocked the number, deleted the message, and returned to my boyfriend who was making hot chocolate in the kitchen. I told him about the message. We laughed at the absurdity of it, and then we moved on with our evening. Savannah, like my parents, had no power over me anymore. Their opinions, their demands, their crises were no longer my concern. The new year arrived with possibilities and goals. I enrolled in a graduate program to earn my Master of Science in Nursing, with a focus on emergency and trauma care. My hospital offered tuition reimbursement, so I would be able to complete the degree without taking on any debt. I was planning to eventually move into an advanced practice role, possibly as a nurse practitioner or clinical specialist, positions that would allow me to have even more impact on patient care and departmental protocols. My boyfriend and I discussed moving in together permanently and possibly getting engaged in the coming year. We talked about buying a house in Seattle, putting down roots in the city that had become my true home. I was building a future based on my values, my goals, and my vision for what a good life looked like. Nothing about that future involved Connecticut, my parents, or attempting to salvage relationships with people who had never valued me. In February, my grandmother called with news that she was planning to visit me in Seattle in the spring. She was 80 years old now, but still sharp, independent, and adventurous enough to make the cross-country trip. I was thrilled and immediately began planning her visit, researching accessible attractions and activities, preparing the guest room in our apartment, and looking forward to showing her the life I had built. She mentioned that my parents had asked if she would try to convince me to reconcile during her visit, and she had told them firmly that she would do no such thing. She supported my decision completely and had no intention of serving as their messenger or advocate. This was a visit between a grandmother and her granddaughter, not a diplomatic mission on behalf of people who had proven themselves unworthy of my forgiveness or presence. Her unwavering support meant everything to me and reinforced that I was making the right choice in maintaining my boundaries. March brought unexpected news through my grandmother. My father had suffered a heart attack, not a massive one, but serious enough to require hospitalization and intervention. He was stable and expected to recover, but the event had shaken the entire family. My grandmother called to inform me, careful to say that she wasn't asking me to return or reach out, just letting me know as a matter of factual information. She said my mother had asked if I would come home to visit him in the hospital, and my grandmother had already told her that she doubted I would and that they shouldn't expect it. She was right. I felt a distant concern, the way you might feel hearing about a stranger's medical emergency, but no pull to return or offer support. My father had told me, clearly and publicly, that he wished I weren't his daughter. He had chosen Savannah over me every single day of my life. His heart attack was unfortunate, but it didn't erase decades of emotional neglect or change the fundamental truth that he had never been the father I needed or deserved. I did send flowers to the hospital with a card that simply read, "Wishing you a full recovery," with no name, no return address, no indication of who had sent them. It was a gesture of basic human decency, nothing more and nothing less. My grandmother later told me that my mother had cried when the flowers arrived, convinced they were from me and interpreting them as a sign that I still cared and might be willing to reconnect. She was reading far too much into what was essentially a polite acknowledgement of a medical crisis. I had no intention of following up the flowers with phone calls or visits or any opening of the door I had firmly closed. My father's health scare didn't change my evaluation of our relationship or make me suddenly forget why I had left. If anything, it reinforced my decision. Life was too short to spend it seeking approval from people who would never provide it, or maintaining relationships that drained rather than nourished my soul. April arrived with cherry blossoms blooming throughout Seattle, transforming the city into a pink and white wonderland. My grandmother flew in for her 2-week visit, and I picked her up from the airport with barely contained excitement. Seeing her walk through the arrival's gate, still strong and bright-eyed despite her age, filled me with joy. We spent those 2 weeks exploring Seattle together, visiting Pike Place Market where she was delighted by the fresh flowers and the fish throwers, taking the ferry to Bainbridge Island where we ate lunch overlooking the water, driving to Mount Rainier National Park where she marveled at the massive mountain and pristine wilderness, and spending quiet evenings in my apartment where she taught me Portuguese recipes and told me stories about her childhood in Portugal and her immigration journey to America. She met my boyfriend and approved wholeheartedly, telling me in Portuguese that he looked at me the way a man should look at the woman he loves, with respect and admiration and genuine affection. During one of our quiet conversations late at night, she told me more details about the situation in Connecticut. My father's heart attack had been a wake-up call for my parents in multiple ways. They had started going to therapy, both individual and couples counseling, trying to address the patterns and behaviors that had destroyed their relationship with me and created such dysfunction in their family. My mother had apparently spent several sessions just crying and talking about her regrets regarding how she had treated me. My father had admitted that his favoritism toward Savannah had been obvious and wrong, driven by some outdated notion that pretty, charming daughters were more valuable than serious, career-focused ones. They were both coming to terms with the reality that their choices had consequences, that they had driven away the daughter who would have been there for them, and that they were stuck with the daughter who only cared about herself. My grandmother said that Savannah had not visited my father even once during his hospital stay, claiming she was too busy with job searching, though she was actually just too self-absorbed to care about anyone's problems but her own. My grandmother also told me something that surprised me. My aunts, my father's sisters, had apparently organized a family meeting without my parents to discuss providing financial support for my grandmother as she aged. They had always assumed my parents would be the primary caregivers and financial supporters for their mother, but they now recognized that my parents were in no position to help anyone, including themselves. During this meeting, my Aunt Clara had apparently said that they should try to include me in the planning since I was the only grandchild with both the financial resources and the responsible personality to potentially help with my grandmother's future care needs. My grandmother had firmly told them not to contact me with requests or expectations, that I had already dealt with enough from this family and deserved to live my life without being pulled back into Connecticut drama. But she wanted me to know that, when the time came, if I chose to help her financially or otherwise, she would be grateful, but she expected nothing and wanted no obligation placed on me. I held my grandmother's weather hand and told her that helping her would never be a burden or obligation, that she was the only family member who had ever truly loved me unconditionally, and that I would always be there for her in whatever way she needed. We both cried a little, the good kind of tears that come from being seen and valued and loved exactly as you are. The rest of her visit was filled with joy and laughter, exploring my adopted city and strengthening the bond between us that had always been special, but now felt even more precious. When I took her to the airport for her return flight, we hugged for a long time, and she whispered in Portuguese that she was proud of me and that I had become exactly who I was meant to be. Watching her walk toward her gate, I felt an overwhelming gratitude that at least one person in my biological family had always seen my worth and celebrated my successes. Summer arrived with its characteristic Pacific Northwest beauty, long sunny days perfect for hiking and outdoor adventures. My boyfriend proposed to me during a backpacking trip in Olympic National Park, presenting a ring at the summit of a mountain we had climbed together, with views of forests and oceans stretching endlessly before us. I said yes without hesitation, thrilled to be building a future with someone who treated me as a true partner and equal. We began planning a small wedding for the following spring, guest lists limited to close friends, colleagues, and my grandmother. The question of whether to invite my parents never seriously arose. They had missed my college graduation because they were attending one of Savannah's influencer events. They had missed my nursing school graduation because my mother was helping Savannah move into an apartment she stayed in for only 3 months before moving back home. They had missed every significant moment of my adult life because I was never the daughter worth showing up for. They wouldn't be invited to my wedding, and I felt no guilt or sadness about that decision. In August, I received a letter forwarded through my grandmother, this time from Savannah rather than my parents. The letter was 17 pages long, handwritten in her distinctive loopy script, and it was a masterpiece of manipulation and delusion. She started by saying she had been doing a lot of thinking and personal growth work, that she realized she had been a difficult person and had made mistakes. This acknowledgement, which might have seemed promising, was immediately undermined by everything that followed. She spent pages explaining how hard her life had been since I left, how my departure had created financial strain for our parents, how she had been forced to take terrible jobs because there was no money for her to properly pursue her influencer career, how she had struggled with depression and anxiety watching our family fall apart. Everything was framed as something that had happened to her, with no accountability for her own choices or recognition of how her behavior had contributed to the family's problems. She never once acknowledged the years of favoritism she had enjoyed or the role she had played in my decision to leave. The most absurd part of the letter came toward the end, where Savannah laid out what she called a path forward for our family. She suggested that I should move back to Connecticut, help support our parents financially now that I was making good money, and help fund a return to college so she could finish her degree and potentially pursue a more stable career. She wrote that families should help each other, and that my success meant I had a responsibility to lift up my less fortunate relatives. She actually used the phrase less fortunate to describe herself, as if her current circumstances were the result of bad luck rather than bad choices. She ended the letter by saying she forgave me for abandoning the family and was willing to rebuild our relationship if I was willing to step up and be a better sister and daughter. The sheer audacity of that closing, the positioning of herself as the wronged party graciously offering forgiveness, was almost impressive in its disconnection from reality. I read the entire letter out loud to my fiancé, both of us laughing incredulously at various points, particularly at Savannah's suggestions that I fund her life and move back to Connecticut. When I finished, he asked what I was going to do with it. I walked to our kitchen, pulled out a lighter, and burned the letter page by page in the sink, washing the ashes down the drain when I was done. That was Savannah's letter, and that would be my response. Complete destruction and erasure, exactly what she deserved. I didn't write back, didn't acknowledge receipt, didn't engage in any way. She had taken enough of my time and energy over the years. She wouldn't get another moment of either. My grandmother called a few days later to ask if I had received Savannah's letter, and I confirmed that I had received it and disposed of it. She chuckled and said she had suspected as much, and that she had told Savannah writing to me was pointless, but Savannah had insisted on trying anyway.